Okay, everyone, so I hope this system is working. Welcome to this joint economics department and HEDG Hosts event. It's the first time we've had one of our HEDG Hosts sort of in real life, as it is. The previous ones have all been online. Just a few practical things about that. Those of you who are online, it's the Zoom webinar system, which means that you will need to use the Q&A function in Zoom. You can't ask questions through the chat. You have to ask questions through the Q&A function. The rest of you, of course, you just ask questions at the end in the usual way, right? Okay, so without further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome Carl-Johan Dalgaard to University of Southern Denmark. He has been a professor since 2008 at the University of Copenhagen. He's affiliated with HEDG in Warwick and with the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. Since 2014, he has served on the Danish Economic Councils and since 2020 as chair. Carl-Johan has worked on growth, development, and macroeconomics. His work has touched on foreign aid, growth theory, productivity, lightning, and IT, and linking economics to biology. But he has also worked on medieval monks, on ancient Romans, and on fish. So quite an eclectic group of things. So I mean, personally, I would say I think he's one of the most creative and brilliant thinkers that there is in Denmark today. And I'm really excited to see what he's going to tell us about the importance of economic history for economic policy.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that much too generous introduction, obviously. The first rule of public speaking, as far as I'm told, is manage expectations. And you just destroyed that entirely. But I guess I'll just carry on as if nothing has happened, despite what you have done to me. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation. So I've been asked to reflect upon the importance of economic history for economic policy. And as should be evident from also the introduction that Paul just gave, I have to confess that I'm not a card-carrying economic historian myself. I consider myself a macroeconomist, but I have done a lot of work on understanding the historical roots of comparative development. And I have worked with economic historians, some of whom are in this room and people outside this room. So indirectly, I've worked on economic history. But this is all to say that whenever I say economic history today, I mean sort of economic history in this sort of broader sense, not only sort of economic history in a very narrow sense, but also involving the literature that revolves around the historical growth patterns, and which is perhaps too many categorized within macro. So it's economic history in that sense. Okay, so let's see if we can get this to work. So let me, in order to frame this discussion, let me start with a question that seems to routinely pop up in public debates, namely, so is economic a science? And to my mind, the answer is yes, but it carries with it a very important margin note, namely that it's a social science. And by saying that, I'm not trying to be evasive in some way. Quite on the contrary, it's the recognition that social sciences is kind of a place where natural sciences and humanities meet, or if you wish, at times intersect even. And I think that's true in general for social sciences, but to my mind, it's very evident when it comes to economics, and it's evident from the perspective that at its core, economics involve kind of two intellectual enterprises. So one consists of what we call positive economics. So this is the descriptive arm of what we do. And this is where we're trying to understand how the economy functions. And I'll argue that in this regard, we owe a rather extensive intellectual debt to natural sciences. But there's another arm in what we do, or another endeavor, which involves normative economics, which is prescriptive in nature and where we usually end up providing some advice about which to the tune of what we consider optimal. Usually this is, in other words, an area where welfare is involved. And in this dimension, I would argue, we owe a sizable intellectual debt to the humanities. And I'll elaborate a bit on that as we go along. So inherently, I'm going to argue that economic history in the broadest sense, I think, is instrumental essentially to both types of endeavors and both dimensions, and ultimately, therefore, for the enterprise of economics, broadly speaking, being a science, a social science. So, of course, if you think that economic policy should be research-based or science-based, I happen to think that that's better. If that's possible, then it stands to reason that economic history, therefore, is important to policy. Now, I'm going to argue that there's perhaps a little bit more to it than that, but I'll get back to that as we go along. So, but I'm going to start with the positive side of things, positive economics. And as I said, in this dimension, I think we, as economists, owe a great deal of a great intellectual debt to what goes on in natural sciences, by which I mean, this is about the systematic measurement of economic phenomena. It's about the analysis of said data using formal statistical tools. It's about also systematic theorizing about economic phenomena using the language of mathematics. The latter is useful from the perspective that it provides some discipline and requires us to be sufficiently precise that, at least at the best of times, it's possible to falsify theories at the end of the day. So those are the broad senses in which I mean we owe an intellectual debt, because all of these processes is something that is inherent in the natural sciences. Now, obviously, we are not similar even in this dimension to every single natural science you can come up with. We are not very similar to, let's say, physics. And that's largely because within physics, empirical insights are ultimately driven by, exclusively, I would say, controlled experiments. Now, it's true in economics in recent years that controlled experiments are increasingly playing a role. But I think it's fair to say that largely in our field, we obtain a lot of insights by analyzing natural experiments through historical comparisons, which is not what you find, obviously, in physics. But then again, you find it in other natural science disciplines. So in that sense, we are more similar to fields like geology or experimental biology, or evolutionary biology, let's say, not experimental. In evolutionary biology, all of these are areas where you can't literally turn back the clock and start the planet's evolution from the beginning, changing one factor and then seeing what happens. So you have to rely on other things in order to obtain insights. So in that sense, we're, even in the positive realm, we're more similar to some natural sciences than others, obviously. Now, for future reference, I want to make the point that we spend actually a huge amount of time on what we could call foundations of knowledge in this area within positive economics. And what I mean by that is, of course, we discuss things like quality of data or reliability of estimators or robustness of regularities or even robustness of theoretical results, all of which, I mean, any paper, any sort of scientific paper you find will involve, within the realm of positive economics, will involve sort of an extensive discussion of one or several of these aspects. And as a consequence, of course, these sort of discussions also finds their way into the lecture theater. It's also something we spend a lot of time discussing with students, these sort of aspects. Okay, so how does economic history then matter for positive economics. I think, you could spend a little bit more time than I'm planning on this topic, but here I'm going to focus on what I consider sort of the main dimensions in which it's important. So evidently and obviously, economic history produces data, which is sort of a core element in the enterprise of positive economics. So from a very practical perspective, this is one major contribution from economic history. It also delivers knowledge of natural experiments. It alerts us to the availability at times of natural experiments, which we in turn can utilize in order to gain insight about economic phenomena. History is full of them. And again, there are lots of examples, and instead of sort of discussing some of them, I'll just refer you to the handbook chapter by David Cantoni and Norm Jochman that I mentioned here on the slide, which, well, as you can tell from the title, discusses a range of them. So it also delivers, obviously, historical comparisons by its very nature. That's also what economic history can do. At times, these historical comparisons are extremely useful in perhaps increasing our confidence in insights that are gained otherwise through empirical analysis that in many ways may be having rather strong claims to establishing cause and effect. So it can support knowledge that we obtain perhaps through, shall we say, more meticulous empirical work. So for instance, I mean, labor economists have spent, I don't know, half a century establishing a causal impact of education on, let's say, productivity. Some people are still discussing certainly the magnitudes, but personally, I think that they're probably right, that there is a causal effect, but I have to admit that I'm a little bit more sure of that, knowing that systematically human capital seems to, or education seems to have been a process unleashed and intensified during repeated instances of takeoffs to economic growth at the macro level. So in that sense, these sort of knowledge of these historical processes help in some ways, sometimes, increase our confidence. At other times, of course, it does the opposite. It might lower our confidence in links that we believe we fully understand and at least gives rise to pause and causes us to reflect on whether we think we actually at the end of the day fully understand the phenomenon we're talking about. So one example would be that you all know that there is an intense debate both in the media but also academically about how to think about the evolution of the natural real rate of interest over, let's say, the last 40, 50, 60 years or so, where there is a clear tendency for the natural real rate of interest apparently to decline over time. And one potential cause, which is discussed in the literature and oftentimes also in the media, is that this might be associated with declining productivity growth, because a very robust implication of most long-run sort of models that we have in our toolbox would also tell us that faster productivity growth would usually be associated with higher real rates of interest. And since the real rate of interest is going down, perhaps this is reflecting that productivity growth is going down, thereby, sort of coinciding with a discussion about what's going on with productivity growth. And that sounds to be this potential story. There's a lot of other potential theories. But then, in this case, you notice that suddenly economic historians present you with evidence such as what I have on the slide, which shows you the long-run evolution of what we could call sort of a risk-free real rate of interest, spanning, in this case, oceans of time, going back to the 14th century. And even if you're not comfortable thinking about real, interest rates before the time where we as a species had a sense of probability and whatnot, so just confine attention to, let's say, the 19th century onwards, there is this apparent regularity that the real rate has been systematically declining since, let's say, 1820. So this process that we associate with perhaps the last several decades is perhaps part of a much broader thing. Now, of course, if you close your eyes and imagine what possibly can have been going on with productivity growth over that time frame between 1820 and today, I think it would be universally agreed that productivity growth today is faster than at the turn of the 19th century. And nevertheless, the real rate has been declining. Now, that doesn't mean that the mechanism I've been talking about can't possibly be true, that the declining real rate now might be associated with declining productivity growth, but somehow it makes us a little uncomfortable, or at least me, because it makes you wonder whether the link between growth and the real rate is as strong as we tend to think as macroeconomists. Now, moving on to normative economics, so here I would argue we owe an intellectual debt to the humanities, actually, and moral philosophy in particular. In some ways, perhaps this enterprise of talking about normative economics actually in some ways turns economics into something of an art form as well as a science. Now, in a lot of actual policy work, when you think about models that are being used across the world for policy analysis, usually the starting point somehow would be something very specific. It would usually be something like a utilitarian approach, in fact. We derive utility from, let's say, consumption or leisure, and we can gauge welfare on the basis of the amount of resources we have at our disposal. That's certainly one systematic way in which you think about what constitutes the good life, in a way. And it has certainly owes some history or a lineage to moral philosophers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and Henry Sedgwick and so forth. But it's not the only way in which you can think about well-being. That is the approach that's usually taken in policy-oriented modeling. Another choice could be to follow someone like Amartya Sen, who criticized deeply this utilitarian approach to thinking about well-being. And according to Sen, what is decisive for well-being is not necessarily the resources you have at your disposal per se, it's what you can do or be with those resources that matter. Now, so for instance, imagine a situation with two individuals, both of whom are consuming the same amount, but below, let's say, their basal metabolism. So if you're utilitarian in the way that it's usually employed in policy work, you would say these two individuals are, well, equally well off or equally destitute, depending on how you want to think about it. But suppose that one of these two individuals are starving deliberately for religious reasons, let's say. Are we then equally sure that these two individuals are identical in terms of their well-being? Well, probably not. The act of choice possibly matters to our sense of well-being. Another way to think about it has to do with the range of choices at your disposal, rather than perhaps whether you've chosen or not in this sense, and whether the choice itself matters per se. So for instance, imagine two individuals with the same amount of income, same resources. And again, our standard approach would tell us that these two individuals are equally happy or dissatisfied, depending on how you want to think about it. But suppose one of these two individuals has a disability. And then the question becomes, even though they have the same amount of resources, would that allow the person with disability to participate in society in the same way that the person without a disability? Well, probably not, because this sort of range of options available to you for any given amount of income will not necessarily be the same, because one has to overcome certain obstacles due to this disability. It's harder to attend a movie, let's say, or whatever. So what I'm trying to say here is that this is a very different way of thinking about well-being than what we usually invoke when we think about welfare in policy analysis. And it's probably not innocuous. It may matter for which policies we would think are good policies. So as one example, so think about the policy of running a welfare state effectively. So, and imagine, well, as you know, there's in the public debate a lot of discussions, usually not something that leaves positive feelings towards economists on this subject, right? So on the one hand, you will have, let's say, the administrative level or administrative in general level, which usually involves economists or like-minded social scientists, who would argue that the welfare state in many instances is run very, very effectively, and work circumstances are better than they ever been. And at the same time, you will find trade unions channeling the views of their members, let's say social workers, taking care of the elderly, who are arguing that working conditions are horrible and they've never been worse somehow. And at first, your first inclination would be to say, well, both can't obviously be right at the same time, but maybe they can. So suppose, for instance, you think as a utilitarian and you're an economist and you're planning things and you're saying, I've come up with this brilliant way in which to organize, let's say, the social work associated with the elderly. I've rationalized this, which means that the social worker needs to spend a certain amount of time, let's say, I don't know, 5-10 minutes, whatever you find reasonable, with each of the elderly during a day. And if everybody follows this recipe, we will be extremely effective. And we can serve all the citizens. And hey, we are so productive, so we can even offer a little higher wages to the social workers. Now, meanwhile, the social worker on a day-to-day basis might find that what makes their work relevant and even effective is their ability to make the choice on any given weekday to spend more time with Fru Jensen, less time with Fru Petersen on Tuesday, because on Tuesday, Fru Jensen needs more company. But on Thursday, it might be the other way around. But now suddenly there is this structure which tells you that you don't have a choice in the matter. You have to spend 10 minutes, no more, no less. So you remove this choice from your workday. Now, maybe that even destroys your sense of relevance of your job. It certainly makes you perhaps feel that your work is no longer as effective as it used to be. What I'm trying to say, if social workers are thinking a little bit along the lines of Sen, and economists tend to think a little bit like utilitarians, both can, in some sense of the word, be right at the same time. It's an example of how I think this choice of metric for well-being can matter and potentially matter a lot for what we deem to be optimal policies in concrete situations. And I think I'm willing to claim that as a profession, it seems to me that we tend to dedicate relatively less time to foundations when we're in the normative department. I just mentioned earlier that we spend enormous amount of time on foundations in the positive area. But what I just did was to talk about what we could think about as foundations of what we mean by welfare and well-being, which underlies prescriptions, optimal, this, that, and the other. This sort of conversation, it seems to me, that we are not having enough of. And just as illustration to this point, so our profession has given out 53 Nobel Prizes until today. 3 of those are with reference explicitly to welfare. 3. And I would say that if I were to be a little bit tough on this whole thing, I would say that Deaton his contributions is very much in terms of consumption, and indirectly, therefore, it matters a lot for welfare in our usual conception. And he's been working a lot on poverty and consumption service and poverty matters as well for welfare. But it's not exactly the same as you would think about contributions by Arrow or certainly Sen. So what about teaching? Well, as I said, if you pick up a paper published in Journal of Very Important Economics that involves optimal something, tax policy, monetary policy, do they have an extensive discussion of the moral foundations for the notion of well-being? Not so much, obviously. I mean, we kind of agree what that is, and then we tend to move on. And since it's not, I mean, there are exceptions. I know of lots of papers where it happens, but it's just not the usual thing. Now, when it's not part of the standard in the articles that we download from the web, is it then in the textbooks, this sort of discussion along the lines of what I just suggested to you? Well, I mean, so I looked at the textbook by Core, which I think, aside from being a brilliant textbook, is probably the most progressive textbook out there, currently, at least. If you search the register, the index for the word welfare, you only find it in the context of things like social welfare spending. The discussion of what welfare is, what it means, and so forth is not listed. Maybe we don't spend a lot of time discussing these things either at the lectures. Does it matter? Does it, for instance, matter for what economists say, even in public debates? Well, suppose you're faced with the option of potentially closing down an economy because a global pandemic has hit you. What would your view be in this regard? Well, if you're a utilitarian, it's very clear. You would say that's a great idea if and only if the gains from this enterprise, which essentially is about losing lives, and thus the value of that lives that you have saved, exceeds the costs, so lost jobs. And I'm not completely sure, but at times I get the feeling when I follow the debate that at least some who are participating or saying these things or said these things had a feeling that they were being all objective when they were saying it, but they're actually relying on a very specific moral philosophical standpoint, whether they recognize it or not. And as such, they're not being unbiased. So if that's a consequence of the fact that we are, if I'm right, maybe I'm not, maybe you will argue that I'm totally wrong on this. If I'm right that we're not maybe overspending time on talking about welfare, then things like that might be the consequence. I think, and this is where I'll end on the normative side, I mean, the literature on long-run growth that I've been participating in, fundamental determinants on long-run productivity would tend to teach us, suggest that culture is a fundamental determinant of prosperity. It's one of several, but category of determinants. And the reason why we tend to think that culture in this sense, that at least economists, our version of it, is because culture in somehow reflects preferences. It reflects differences in beliefs about what you can expect from other people, for instance, or what you can expect from the government and so forth. And variation in these traits is in part explaining differences in prosperity. But of course, if that's true, which I think a rather compelling case can be made by now, is the case, then I think we should certainly be open to the possibility that, well, for one thing, the same policies will not necessarily lead to the same outcomes when they're implemented in different different areas, meaning different cultural landscapes. And by extension, maybe the sense of well-being or lack thereof that's unleashed by these policies is not necessarily the same everywhere. And I think this, at least to me, teaches some humility when it comes to normative economics. And in that sense, economic history is useful in this regard as well. So turning to the last point, which is sort of getting to the thing that Paul wanted me to talk about more directly, namely economic policy. And so we talked a little bit about policy sometimes maybe are angled towards, well, directly or indirectly welfare or making places, you know, society a better place. And other times it's focused more on specific economic outcomes. This is the case, for instance, when we are looking at a crisis of sorts, so stabilization, you know, stabilized GDP or employment. So this is not so much directly about welfare, it's the more practical thing, you might say. But the question now becomes, how do you diagnose problems? And those of you who already read the slide will see that I'm going to draw a little bit on Barry Eichengreen here. And so this is his Journal of Economic History paper, and I very much agree with what he said. But basically the story is this. You can argue that there are kind of three cognitive processes you could go through when you want to try and diagnose a complicated problem that you perhaps haven't faced before. So one would be to try and gather a ton of facts, all the facts you can get to about what's going on in the economy. And from this universe of facts, try and get a sense of what the hell is going on. And as a result, maybe come up with things you could do to make things better, stabilize the economy. That might be one way to do it. And the problem, of course, is that it's quite time consuming and it's very data heavy. It can be hard to, in a short amount of time to go through this sort of an exercise. Another approach would be to think deductively, and so you use guiding principles, which to an economist would be something like models, and say, so starting from models, what would I do then if I'm hit by this crisis? So that's another way to think about it. Now, you know, that's wonderful, but at times you might be in a situation where you may not have an actual model that describes to you what the sort of crisis you find yourself in the middle of, how to capture it in a model. Then it becomes hard to follow this sort of deductive approach. And that leaves us with the third approach, which is a very basic human thing, which is to think by analogy. So you ask yourself, has something similar occurred before? How did we respond? What to do? And what, you know, maybe we did something the last time this happened, and we certainly shouldn't do that again because that was a really bad idea, and so forth. Now, obviously, Historia is where you run to if that's the approach you need to follow, because analogies are, well, history. And Eichengreen in this paper argues that in the financial crisis, the first two approaches to try to diagnose problems were not really available, in part because of time constraints. That's the first. And second, we didn't really, macroeconomists really at the time didn't have models that allowed us to think through. A lot of work has been subsequently been done to try and fix that. But at the time when the crisis hit, you didn't have those models. And so you would find that economists were running for the hills, where you find all the history books and you say, what the hell, you know, the Great Depression and what happened and what did people do? And it was really history that people sought to in the beginning of the financial crisis, which is why Eichengreen in this presidential address exclaimed that the financial crisis has been good to economic history because it showed you how useful economic history in actual reality is. Now, I think when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, something similar was true initially. Again, this time around, you had better means of collecting data, of course. This is one of the great differences, I would say, to what we saw in a financial crisis, is you had really almost real-time data at your disposal. So there was a lot of option to thinking along those lines. But you certainly didn't have models that adequately captured these things. At the time when the crisis hit, pandemics and how that matters to the macroeconomy was really something that development economists were doing. It certainly wasn't something that macroeconomists we've been contemplating in the context of advanced, complicated, economies, how do they respond if you suddenly make people afraid of socializing? So once again, I would say that we tended to run for the hills, or at least in the beginning. So very rapidly saw a lot of models coming out. So the profession responded very quickly to this lag. But initially, certainly, you didn't see much of it. And just as a small illustration, this is Google Trends for searches on spanske syge, which is perhaps the natural analogy you would come to mind for the year of 2020. And you can see that when the Prime Minister, she announces that we're closing down the economy, or the public sector at least, almost immediately, the number of Google searches for things like Spanish flu or spanske syge just skyrockets. And again, there's nothing unusual about it. Again, it's a very human thing. I mean, we search for analogies and say, what's the analogy? Oh my God, there is an analogy? Okay, so we search the web for it. I think we do the same, even if economists think they have models. So this is another example from Google Trends searches. This is for 2022 for the word stagflation. And you see an immediate spike there, basically the day that Putin invades Ukraine. Then that's off the chart in Denmark. Again, I think this is something where people are searching for analogies, something you've seen before. You're worried that something like this will happen again, and you try to think about what to expect. Okay, so in summation, I think economic history is very important for economic policy, in part because it helps make economics really what I would think of as a science. And here I will refer you to all the stuff I said on positive economics. And I think in that sense, economic history is important because to the extent possible, of course, policy should be science-based. There are situations where it can be really hard, but that is a nice objective, I think. And as such, economic history is important for policy. It's also where you find analogies, and analogies are really useful. And incidentally, sometimes analogies are really bad analogies once you think about it. And so what economic history in more detailed sense also helps you do is shift through analogies. Sometimes people say, it's a great analogy. It's like, no, it's a really bad idea. Actually, I know what you're saying, but it's a really bad analogy. You should stop thinking about that. Here's another analogy. You should use that. So again, these processes requires actually some historical understanding. Now, of course, sometimes policies is not necessarily directed towards stabilization or crisis management, but more structural policies, let's say, which involve welfare in one way or another. I would say the economic history is useful here because, again, it, to me at least, warrants that it's very likely that identical policies in two societies may not unleash the same sense of well-being, certainly not the same outcomes. There's a lot to be learned in this regard, I admit, but it instills a certain amount of humility, I think, when it comes to our prescriptive arm in our endeavor. And you know, at the same time, I'm also sort of baffled a little bit when you follow the public debate. Oftentimes, you probably also have witnessed many times where economics is charged with being biased in one way or another, sort of not value-free, or maybe even politically biased in one way or another. And the curious part is that it's almost always with reference to what goes on in the positive realm of things. So it's in the context of saying, you know, when labor supply goes up, employment goes up. So, oh, you're biased. What do you mean? I mean, this is, you know, again, it's based on, it's not based on moral philosophy. It's data analysis. That the analysis might be wrong, but that's a difference. Certainly not directed towards being biased. At the same time, you know, I almost never see people complain about normative economics. And it seems to me that if you want to complain about economics there, that's where you want to go if you want to complain. So let me finish up with a quote from one of my heroes, John Maynard Keynes. So so what Keynes said in the context of Alfred Marshall's obituary, he wrote The master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He must be mathematician, historian, statesman, philosopher in some degree. He must understand symbols and speak in words. He must contemplate the particular in terms of the general and touch abstract and concrete in the same flight of thought. He must study the present in light of the past for the purposes of the future. No part of man's nature or his institutions must be entirely outside his regard. He must be purposeful and disinterested in a simultaneous mood, as aloof and incorruptible as an artist, yet sometimes as near to earth as a politician. Well, eloquent for sure. But it seems to me that what this really is saying is that the Keynes were very much aware that economics was a social science. And in so being a little bit both of a science and maybe an art form. It's certainly a really tall order if this is what it means to be a social scientist, but I think maybe that shouldn't stop us from trying. Thank you for your attention.